So the title of the talk, what did lumberjacks have to do with human automation interaction? And this talk is really a tribute to two people. First, Roger Parasuram, I'm a friend and colleague who we've worked together on complacency, the degree of automation concept, and air traffic control. And of course, also to the late Bob Willigas, who we're all very sad to lose him. And he certainly helped to lure me into the study of aviation psychology. So the background of my talk, I'm going to spend a little time talking about imperfect automation and situation awareness and how they are linked. And then I'll talk about two experiments. Experiment one, having to do with the robotics arm, and experiment two, imperfect air traffic control conflict resolution aid, and the benefits to that aid of automation transparency. I have a part of a talk on a computational model of automation complacency, but for reasons of time, I won't be able to talk about that at all. I'll give a pointer to it and ask you to contact me offline if you want more information about it. So what is the lumberjack analogy? Well, the idea is that automation helps when it is correct, the tree stands, and it hurts when it falls. When automation fails, the tree falls, and the higher it stands, the harder it falls. So I'm going to offer 5 layers of argument. First, that automation helps. Secondly, that automation can fail. Third, when automation fails, the human may show a poor response in failure management related to the loss of situation awareness. Fourth, the higher the degree of automation, the greater benefits when automation performs correctly, and the greater problems when automation fails. And finally, these greater problems can be mitigated by transparency, which supports automation or supports situation awareness. All of these are common sense, intuitive points, but it's important to provide data from realistic experiments that support that. And that's what I'd like to do with the 2 experiments I'll talk about. So walking through these arguments in more detail, automation provides a benefit, reduces workload, increases performance, safety, and productivity, one or more of all of those. And frankly, if automation didn't do any of those things, we wouldn't use it and it wouldn't be worth studying. Secondly, automation is imperfect. It can fail. And we can think of myriad examples, but for example, the software or hardware failure, the software bug, or the calculator battery dies in the middle of your final exam. We know the Tesla crash when the Tesla turned into an oncoming truck was a failure of automation to work appropriately. And automation can also fail, in quotes, because it fails in a way that is expected by the human user, who has a different mental model of the process and logic underlying that automation. And the recent example of this are the 2 737 MAX crashes, disasters, in which automation behaved in a way that was unexpected and unpredicted by the pilots. So the third level of argument is that when automation fails, the humans sometimes can't deal with the failure, cannot cope. And these are disasters of the safety critical systems that may offset the benefits when automation works correctly. And this trade-off between benefits and cost is a key function of my talk today. And so there's several examples, again, of human not coping with automation failures: the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant disaster, the 2008 financial crash in which there were complex derivatives being traded through automation that brokers and traders really couldn't understand completely. Another classic aircraft crash, 213 Asiana aircraft crashed approaching the San Francisco airport. The airplane flight management system was so complex, it was doing things the pilots could not understand, and there were lives lost in that crash. And once again, we can refer to the Tesla crash. The question we ask then is, why does the human sometimes fail to cope with the automation failures? And to look at that, we delve into the psychology of the human operator. And a key concept here is this notion of útluf. Sounds like a city in Iceland, but it also stands for out of the loop unfamiliarity. And this describes the human's poor response when automation unexpectedly fails. And that OODA loop can be attributed to breakdowns, first of all, in noticing that something is wrong. And there's a whole psychology of change blindness that deals with people's failure to notice unexpected events. And this leads to complacency, which is the failure to monitor an otherwise highly reliable automation system. There was a near accident over the Pacific Ocean where in China Airlines, and the pilots failed to monitor the engine thrust until it was too late, and the plane did a barrel roll and almost crashed into the Pacific Ocean. And this is what we call a loss of stage 1 situation awareness, according to Micah Ensley's stage model of SA. And I'll talk more detail about that shortly. Secondly, OODA loop is related to a failure to understand what is wrong, and this is a loss of stage 2 situation awareness. If you don't understand the state of the system, you're going to have a delayed or incorrect response if and when the automation fails. And this results from the fact that the human is oftentimes no longer making active responses in controlling the system, flying the aircraft. And as we know from the generation effect in educational psychology, when you fail to, or when you're not acting to change the state, you don't have a good memory of what that state is. This is exacerbated because much automation lacks a transparency of what it's doing and why. And a third factor is called de-skilling, and that is you've used automation for so long that the manual skills it replaced have degraded. So the pilot may have forgotten how to hand fly the aircraft, or you may have forgotten how to do long division by hand when your calculator fails. We're going to focus on these first two sources. I'm not going to talk about de-skilling, but the idea is the poor human response to the automation failure, what we call a failure response, happens particularly the first time automation fails. And this is what I call the first failure effect in automation fault management. And that's because the failure is totally unexpected. So the little schematic graph, we've got a measure of performance here. Automation is going along, behaving correctly. The first time it fails, our performance is really poor. Subsequent failures, it still may be bad, but since we expect it now, we're a little bit better prepared. But I'm going to focus on these first failures. So the challenge is, can we fix the automation failure response without reducing the very benefits of automation that lead us to want to use it in the first place? And we think we can through the concept of transparency. We think we can therefore offer a free lunch of getting rid of the costs with not also mitigating the benefits. The fourth level of argument has to do with this concept of the degree of automation which underlies the higher tree. And the approaches to automation, and really I developed this with Raja Parasherman, Tom Sheridan way back in the 2000s, is related to two concepts that underlie the degree of automation. The first of these is the stage of automation. And this is the idea that automation can assist human performance at two different stages of information processing. There are actually 4 stages underlying the original model, but I'm only going to talk about 2. And that is the notion, first of all, it can help understanding situation assessment, give the user an understanding of what's going on. And secondly, automation can also help the user in making a decision of what do we do about what's going on. So this 2-stage dichotomy of stages of automation is very important. We can also talk about levels of automation that underlie each one of these stages, and that is at each stage, designers can vary the level of automation, which is essentially how aggressively or autonomously does automation serve at each of these different stages. How much human, cognitive, and motor work does the automation replace, therefore alleviating human workload? So this 2-by-2 dichotomy in which we look at 2 different stages and for simplicity, two different levels, low and high, we can apply this to an aircraft conflict detection automation. In the early stage of situation assessment, a low level of automation may simply display to the pilot all of the nearby traffic area, whereas a higher level of automation, you've got algorithms doing filtering that now filter and only show the pilot the most critical aircraft that might represent a conflict. Now, a pilot has a situation assessment on possible conflicts. You have a decision aid that can kick in. And if there is a collision imminent, either offer the possible courses of actions. It can say climb or turn and let the pilot decide what to do. Or it at a high level can simply make a decision, climb, 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 and at extremely high level can actually take the aircraft and start it climbing. 2x2 dichotomy. And so now we talk about, introduce the concept of the degree of automation and underline the lumberjack hypothesis. So if we look at this 2x2 matrix, either going to a later stage and or to a higher level, or both, is what we describe as increasing the degree of automation. So we've essentially mapped these two dimensions onto a single vector. And the higher the degree of automation, the greater it helps when it's working right, but the more it hurts, particularly when it fails the first time. Let's take this 2x2 matrix, basically reorient it, and we're now going to put the degree of automation on the x-axis and a measure of performance on the y-axis, and the green line represents normal performance when things are working correctly, and the red line represents the failure, particularly the first failure. Classic example of failure performance is this big emphasis on the takeover response time in self-driving cars. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that concept. Okay, so let's talk then and delve into the lumberjack analogy. Again, the higher degree of automation, the greater the benefit when it works, and the greater the cost when it fails. And that represents these two schematic trees, a low tree and a high tree. This is a graphic representation, and I'd like you to make a good mental representation of this because I'm going to be coming back to this as we go through our two experiments. Degree of automation, lower situation awareness support, higher decision support. Correct responses, failure responses. Keep that interaction in mind because that's the trade-off. Where do we get the data to support this idea? Well, it came from a meta-analysis that I did with two of my colleagues in Germany. And we looked at all the studies that had varied degree of automation, either by stages or levels, and it measured some measure of human automation performance doing the collective task, and we found that higher degrees led to better performance, a higher tree. We also looked at those studies that examined human response to automation failures, and we found that those studies that had, it was a smaller number, led to the downward slope, the harder fall. We then asked what underlies this increased cost of at higher degrees of automation when the automation fails, and the answer is we hypothesized a loss of situation awareness. And so we also looked at those studies which had simultaneously measured situation awareness through one technique or another and found a gently reducing but statistically significant decline. Greater DOA, more loss of situation awareness. And returning to Micah Ensley's model, situation is lost at Ensley's level 1 situation, that is at higher degrees of automation, people look less at the process that automation is supporting, a visual scanning or visual attention. And this will be evaluated in our first experiment. But also situational awareness is lost at level 2 because at a higher degree of DOA, people fail to understand what automation is doing. when it does fail. And the final level of argument is we are arguing that transparency supports situation awareness and therefore can buffer the first failure response. And I loosely define transparency as a graphic or text-based explanation of what automation is doing and why it's doing it. It often involves a clear, intuitive depiction of the information input to the automation. That is what the automation is processing, the raw data it's processing. And we will evaluate the specific benefits of transparency in the second experiment. So how can we as human factors people address this trade-off? Is there a free lunch where we can fix the costs without reducing the benefits? Well, according to the model, of course, if we reduce the level of automation, we're going to reduce the costs, but we'll also reduce the benefits. It's not a free lunch. But if we can put transparency into the automation system, we can flip this response from a downward slope to a level slope, and therefore create a free lunch, which is what we'd like to try to do. So the first experiment is one that was involved looking at how human operators supervise 2 degrees of automation in a robotics arm task supported by NASA Johnson Space. This is the couple of write-ups. And again, the operator's task was to control a robotics arm with a 6 degree of freedom controller to essentially grab a payload, lift it up, move it across an obstacle, a hazard obstacle, and down on the other side. Turns to be a very difficult task. Astronauts require a lot of training to do it. Our simplified but realistic simulation at Michigan still required several hours of training, okay? Interestingly, when I was preparing the PowerPoints for that, I looked out my window and there was a robotic arm moving a tree out of the garden. Total coincidence of timing. But in the simulator, in our simulation of this, which we took from the NASA Johnson, this is the simulator people use, they have to basically look at 4 different camera views. They use a GUI over here to control characteristics of it. And I'd like you to look in detail at this idea. Here's the trajectory that you're supposed to take the payload on that goes up across a hazard and down the other side, and follows this guidance line that here I've represented by an orange line, which is not actually present in the camera view for most of the time. So we had our operator here looking at the displays in the GUI controlling this task. And in one condition, they did it manually with no automation support. In the case of decision or automation situation awareness support, they actually could see that orange line as a trajectory to follow, but they still had to manually track it with the 6 degree of freedom controller. But at a high degree of automation, we had a decision and action support that would allow an autopilot to actually follow the orange line. And the operator still was responsible for monitoring that trajectory and making sure that nothing went wrong. Our prediction, automation and the higher degree of automation would support progressively better routine performance, that is reduced tracking error and reduced mission time. A very brief description of the procedures. Our subjects, which are graduate students in engineering at Michigan, had several of hours of practice with perfect automation that followed the correct XYZ coordinates of where you had to make your turn to avoid the hazard. Then they proceeded with 7 experimental trials, and which we predicted automation would help. It would reduce workload, it would increase precision, and on the last trial, there was a single failure, an unexpected failure, in which the trajectory was given the wrong XYZ coordinates to avoid the hazard. Our prediction, of course, is that we would get progressively better performance with automation, but as far as a failure to deal with an unexpected failure, it would be small with the manual, greater with the guidance, and greatest all with the automatic control situation. The failure of the manual condition was because the subjects were simply given the wrong coordinates at which they were supposed to make their turn. So what did we find? Let's look at the bottom of this slide and look at the results. First of all, performance when automation worked correctly on those 6 trials. We had a measure of speed, how rapidly they could do the mission, and accuracy, how closely did they follow a straight trajectory. In the manual condition, that's supported by the orange line, and that with full automated control, the highest degree of automation. And the key thing I want to show you here is that these lines slope upwards in terms of our collective measure of performance. So here's our manual condition, and here's the lower and higher degree of automation. Things are getting better. And that's good. We'd anticipated that, but we were glad to see it. The key thing is what happened on that automation failure trial. And remember, this is where you're given the wrong coordinates of where to make this turn from going across the hazard to suddenly going down. This is what you're supposed to do. These are the incorrect XYZ coordinates that lead you, if you follow them, on a trajectory that's dangerously close. In fact, it slightly penetrates or bumps into our virtual hazard. In the manual condition, they were given the wrong coordinates to turn. In the automation condition for situation awareness, that orange line, that's the correct path to follow, was no longer the correct path. And in the auto control condition, the orange line was wrong, and the autopilot followed that orange line incorrectly. I should say that this particular instantiation of an automation failure was developed in conjunction with collaboration with our colleagues at NASA Johnson as being a realistic type of automation failure. So this is what we found when automation was correct. What did we find when the automation failed? And what you're looking at here is a measure for the failure response. It's a composite measure of when people actually bumped into the hazard or when they came dangerously close to the hazard. That is, they penetrated what would be considered a danger zone. And our objective measure of performance replicated the prediction very nicely. And so we have this, basically the trade-off function that we predict from the lumberjack. The higher the tree, the greater it stands, but the harder it falls. There's an awful lot of stuff that goes behind this, and I don't have time to talk about it. But again, I can direct it to the papers. And I want to point out at this point, we also developed a computational model of this complacency effect that would predict the extent to which people would stop scanning or less carefully scan the display where the trajectories are shown under progressively higher levels of automation. And in our model, we use that scanning prediction. Let's see, where am I? That scanning prediction to develop a complacency model of the actual performance failures. And we validate the model as accounting for a large amount of variance, not only in predicting that performance would be worse here than here, but precisely how much performance would degrade. Fairly complex model, but I'd love to share with you, anyone who's interested, in essentially mixing measures and predictions of eye movements with this issue of automation complacency. Okay, so our conclusion from the first experiment is that the Lumberjack model was supported later stages of automation, that is this autopilot control, helped performance more than earlier stage automation, which was situation awareness support, when the automation was correct, but hurt performance more when automation failed with the bad data on the trajectory coordinates. So we confirmed this hypothesis with 4 different data points, and we modeled the complacency effect on automation failure, which I haven't talked about and won't talk about today, but we did not explicitly provide transparency to see if we could offset this later stage automation failure. That is, fold this curve upwards to get the free lunch. We did hypothesize that the compromised automation failure response resulted from an operator loss of situation awareness at the higher degree of automation. And we hypothesized also that the loss could be mitigated by transparency of the display that depicts the raw data which automation is processing. And that was the goal of experiment 2, to test these hypotheses in the context of an imperfect decision support automation in air traffic management, a late degree of automation in both correct and failure trials. In short, the purpose of experiment 2, well, it's a separate, totally separate experiment and different funding agency and so forth, but was essentially to fold this curve upward with automation transparency. So the second experiment is Fitri Chapsawali's dissertation at Nanyang Technical Institute in Singapore. She's interested in air traffic control, and the controller has 2 responsibilities: productivity, deliver the planes on time, and safety, obviously, to avoid collisions. We zoom into safety, and the idea of safety is to keep any plane out of another plane's protected zone, which is kind of like a hockey puck around each plane. And when this guy does penetrate that protected zone, it's called a loss of separation, and it's a bad thing to happen, but it happens. And there are 2 stages of performance in a conflict avoidance task here. For the air traffic controller to detect a potential conflict, a pending conflict, will there be a loss of separation? And if there is, to offer a conflict resolution maneuver to the pilot. Maneuver the plane, climb, descend, turn, slow down to avoid that potential loss of separation. So if we look at this in terms of the degree of automation, there are lower aids that support situation assessment. These are called conflict detection aids that sit in the controller's workstation. They're about 70 to 80% reliable. They are imperfect, but they still assist controller relative to a manual unaided detection. There are also proposed conflict resolution aids that actually tell the controller how to maneuver to avoid a conflict. They have not yet been implemented in actual live towers. They have been investigated at NASA and at Eurocontrol, but they've been investigated only when they've been perfect. Imperfect conflict resolution aids have not yet been investigated. Yet we can imagine when these get induced, if a conflict resolution is based on imperfect detection, the resolution itself might be imperfect. And that's what Fitri Chapsawali wanted to do in her dissertation at Singapore with the Singapore Air Traffic Control System, who were very, very good at really working with us in developing her simulation and also providing air traffic controllers in the experiment. So the air traffic controller is challenged. Challenged because the display that he or she works with is a 2-dimensional plan view display, and yet conflicts sometimes occur with vertical flight, with ascending and descending aircraft, and maneuvers are given to climb or descend. The imperfect contract CRA automations that have been developed resolves vertical conflicts, but the controller has no vertical display. That is, no transparency about the altitude access. And therefore, we would argue limited vertical situation awareness. We wanted to do something about it, and so we wanted to develop a vertical situation awareness display for the controller. This is what the display actually looked like. I won't go through the description here. Rather, I'll give you a more schematic representation of it. But in short, in her experiment, we're examining two forms of air traffic control automation. The vertical situation display supports early processing of what's going on. The decision aid supports late processing of what do I do about it. Schematic of the vertical situation awareness display. It shows the track of two aircraft over the ground. It represents attitude, and it shows both the actual and also the predicted or planned flight path of two aircraft in a profile view. And we would argue that such transparency can offset the costs of an automation error when the automation is imperfect. That is, when the automation fails. Okay, so the automation stage 2 decision aid that we use, the conflict resolution aid, is basically one that looked ahead when two aircraft were on conflicting paths and would offer the controller advice, climb, climb, or descend, descend, or some other direction to avoid a conflict. And this is when it's working correct. But the automation is imperfectly reliable, and so we asked the question, answered the question, how do we make the automation fail? And the way we did that, the way we designed imperfect automation, is to the advice that it gave would indeed avoid this conflict, but would direct this aircraft in the path of another secondary conflict. And clearly that's a no-no. You wouldn't want an automation aid to do that. But our aid would occasionally, very occasionally fail. Let's see. Oh, where am I? So in this second experiment, which combines the results of two experiments done by my student Fitri, all involved 48 participants, all with prior air traffic control experience. Some of them were actually professional controllers, others were students in advanced training. They performed several blocks of traffic management with a perfectly reliable conflict avoidance aid, and then the aid failed. The recommendation of the failure directed the air traffic control to move the aircraft into the path of a secondary traffic aircraft. And we measured the response of the first failure. That is, how effectively did the controller avoid colliding with this secondary conflict? Our primary measure, half of our participants were given the vertical situation display to support their situation awareness of the vertical dimension. Half did not. Our primary performance measure was the percent of successfully resolved conflicts. There was no loss of separation, no penetration of this danger zone. We actually never had a mid-air collision in our simulation. We also had a secondary measure, a measure of situation awareness, and this is answering a probe questions about the status of the airspace. We used Micah Ensley's classic SAGAT technique. I think many of you are familiar with that. You ask them probe questions in the middle of the simulation. For example, what is the relative altitude of SQ459 compared to another aircraft? I'm going to present now in the last 5 minutes or so of a very abbreviated representation of a much more complex pattern of results, in which I've really just tried to extract those that bear most directly on the lumberjack hypothesis. So this is our first graph. We measured performance, that is percentage success, percentage of trials in which there was no loss of situation awareness. I'm sorry, no loss of separation. It's a performance measure. In a manual condition, and in a condition in which the conflict resolution aid was correctly for a control group that did not have the SA support, did not have the vertical situation display. This distinction, I'm not going to go over it. Some trials where automation was 100% correct. On some trials, it failed one trial out of 6, one time out of 6. That's the failure response we're looking at. And so what we find is for the control group, the CRA does a good job of increasing the success rate, a highly statistically significant result, as long as automation was correct. But on that first failure, which only occurred on the unreliable block, there was a drastic, large and significant drop in performance, that is violations of loss of separation, going down from about 90% down to 64%, as averaged across all our participants. Because of course we only have one observation per participant, since there's only one time each person can experience the first failure. For the group that had the vertical situation display, that is transparency, our normal performance improved a little bit, not a lot, but a little bit, and we're actually pretty close to ceiling. So the VSD did help under normal conditions. However, we look at what happened on the first failure trial, and I've replotted the data of the control condition, and here we look at the failure, the loss of separation performance for those that had the VSD. And what we can see is the VSD really mitigated this first failure cost for the controllers that had that, compared to the controllers that did not. All right. Well, that's our performance measure. We say, why did the VSD help? It helped by improving situation awareness. And so what I plotted here on the y-axis is our measure of the SAGAT percentage correct questions. That is how accurately well people were keeping track of the status of all of the aircraft from these probe questions. And what we see is that the situation awareness level was improved both in the unreliable and the reliable conditions. Okay, so we can kind of make the inference that the improvement in failure management performance was mitigated, at least in part, or mediated in part, by the improvement in situation awareness. So the general conclusions we draw from the two experiments is that in experiment 1, the lumberjack analogy held between low and high degree of automation. But in that experiment with the robotics arm, we didn't explicitly look at a transparency manipulation. In experiment 2, with only the higher degree of automation, the decision, higher degree of automation of decision support, where we failed automation, we got large benefits of the automation over the manual condition. We got large first failure costs, but we also got a large reduction of these costs with the VS display transparency. And the VSD, vertical situation display, also increased situation awareness. In short, we folded this downward limb upwards so it was level. We buffered the fall of the bigger tree. In the second experiment, the air traffic control, we did not examine the failure of a situation support automation. That is, we never actually failed the vertical situation display within the design. So we don't really have all the 6 points necessary to sort of firmly confirm our meta hypothesis. The full experiment remains to be done by anyone that at least I found. I'd love to try it sometime, but we do believe that we can actually soften the fall of the bigger tree with transparency. And I should add, I've done a kind of a quasi meta-analysis of transparency benefits across a lot of different experiments. I'll be reporting that in the 5th edition of our engineering psychology textbook when it comes out. And it really indicates that transparency is one of those solutions that is extremely effective in human factors if it's done right.